Good afternoon, and welcome to Lunching with Books. And today we do have a treat in store for us. The book being reviewed today is Racing Back to Vietnam, and the author is Dr. John Pendergrass. He was an eye surgeon, and is an eye surgeon, a decorated Vietnam veteran, and six-time Ironman triathlon competitor, just like all the other macho men in this room. He graduated from Delta State College and earned his doctorate of medicine from the University of Mississippi. He is the first person over 60 to compete in 6 Ironman triathlons on 6 continents, which served as the inspiration for his first book, Against the Odds. He's the author of 2 books. He's married with 3 children and has practiced ophthalmology in Hattiesburg, Mississippi for more than 10 years. But before I get started, I would like to, since he is a Vietnam veteran, I'd like for the Vietnam veterans in this room to stand. Thank you. We appreciate what you have done for our country, and thank you. At this time, I will turn it over to John, and he will tell us about his book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I don't have any slides or anything, but I brought just some copies of the maps in my book. If you're like me, I hate it when someone's talking about some battle or some war and you can't tell where it is, and it's so much easier with a map. And I have maps of what Vietnam, in my book, of what Vietnam was during the war, what it looks like today, and also a map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I talk a lot in the book about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be here. It's wonderful to see old high school classmates, old medical school classmates, to talk with people who've been in Vietnam. It's really a very rewarding experience, and I thank you all for coming. You know, I was a flight surgeon with the F-4 Phantom Squadron at Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam in 1971 and 72. Looking back, it was the great adventure of my life. When my tour ended, I was discharged from the Air Force. That was the last stop. And I went home and almost immediately started an ophthalmology residency. And I celebrated, like probably many of you did, eight months later when the prisoners of war came home. And then I pretty much forgot about the Vietnam War for some 40 years or so. About 5 years ago, my interest in the Vietnam War was rekindled. I started going back to my fighter wing reunion and doing like all reunions, talking about old times, reliving times, and so on and so forth. I pulled out the 150 or so letters that I wrote mostly to my wife and also to my mother, and they both had the good wisdom to keep them. And I went back and reread those. I still had a copy of my flight records, and I pulled them out and started looking back when I flew and where I flew and so on and so forth. And pretty soon I was really, once again, interested in the Vietnam War. This is a 50th anniversary of many critical battles, events, and so on, in particular 1968. This week, President Johnson, 50 years ago, announced that he would not run for re-election. A little bit earlier this year, the siege of Khe Sanh was lifted, the Tet Offensive, including the Battle of Hue. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy's assassinations were to come, still to come. The turmoil at the 1968 1968 Democratic Political Convention. So 1968 was a big year. And to give you an idea of how big it was, something like it was the worst year of the Vietnam War for casualties. Something like 17,000 Americans were killed that year. That works out to somewhere around 46 people a day. So it was a real active, full-time, wide open war. When a couple of years ago, in 2016, I came across a notice for an Ironman triathlon at Da Nang in Vietnam, the place that I was actually stationed, the city that I was stationed. And that gave me the excuse that I had been looking for to go back to Vietnam. And that basically is the story of my book, my year as a flight surgeon with the F-4 Phantom Squadron and my return to Vietnam 45 years later. I came back in 2016 and I did the Ironman triathlon, and I also spent about a month in the country. I visited Hanoi, I visited Ho Chi Minh City, which is formerly Saigon. I spent a couple of weeks traveling with a group of Marines, and we went to many of the major battle sites that the Marines served in during the Vietnam War. And I even got a guide, and he took me over into Laos, which is a difficult country to visit, back onto the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the spot where I flew so many of my missions during the Vietnam War. So all in all, it was my trip back was a very eventful experience. You know, I was commissioned in the Air Force when I graduated from medical school in 1969, and they asked me, do you want to be a general medical officer or you want to be a flight surgeon? Well, a general medical officer is basically a family practitioner. A flight surgeon is also in many ways a family practitioner, but he also has an added responsibility for the health, safety of the air crews. And because he takes care of the air crews, he is required to have some exposure to flying. In flight surgeon schools, we learn a lot about flying, but we don't learn how to fly. The flying that most flight surgeons do is usually as an observer or someone who's coming along for the ride, but in my case, it was one of those fortunate exceptions where the flying I did in an F-4 Phantom was in the back seat in a slot that's called a weapons systems operator, which is somebody who deals with communication, navigation, radar, and so on. And it also gets an opportunity to sort of fly the plane a little. The F-4 Phantom and the Air Force model is a plane that you can fly from the back seat. So I spent my first year in Florida in a very nice assignment, and then I got my orders to Vietnam. About a month before I went to Vietnam, I got a letter from my sponsor, the flight surgeon who I would be replacing. And he asked me, he said, do you want to do like most of the guys, just live in what we call the medical hooch, the medical barracks, and just get your flying time, tagging along on transports and things like that? Or he said, if you want, you can live with one of the fighter squadrons and live and fly with them. Well, that was an easy choice for me. That's a wonderful opportunity that I knew I would never have in my life, to fly in a Mach 2 fighter, a fighter that's capable of going twice the speed of sound in combat, and I was happy to take that opportunity. When I was in Vietnam, I flew 54 combat missions, but to give you an idea, that's roughly 1/3 what most of the pilots and other weapon systems operators flew. So I flew a lot, but I did not fly as much as the people who were really well trained to do it. And most of my missions a few of them were in South Vietnam in support of American ground troops. But those of you who remember the details of the war will remember by 1971 or so, President Nixon was winding down the ground war. The air war was going wide open, but the ground war was winding down. So we had a few missions where we flew in support of South Vietnamese and American troops, but most of them were what we called interdiction missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail, those of you who have the map can see, lead from North Vietnam westward into Laos and down the trail in Laos, and then exit back east into South Vietnam. And this is where the material would come from North Vietnam. It would come in from the Russians in the port of Haiphong, and it would come in from the Chinese through their rail lines. It would flow unimpeded. At that time of the war, we were not flying in North Vietnam. It would flow unimpeded onto the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and then instead of attacking it at the port where it's being unloaded, it was attacked when it's dispersed and spread out in jungle trails where it was much more difficult to destroy. And it was things like fuel dumps and trucks and things like that, and that's what we spent most of our time doing and flying. The biggest part of my time was spent as a physician. We had a hospital at Da Nang. In 1968, it was wide open. By the time I went there, it was still busy, but it was not as busy as it was then. And we took care of wounded soldiers, Marines, and such who had been treated in field hospitals and stabilized. Then they would be moved to our facility, and we had a hospital, and we took care of them for several days or however long as needed. And then one day, sort of unannounced, transport aircraft would come in, they'd load them up, and they'd be flown back to the United States or to hospitals in the Pacific. So practicing medicine in Vietnam had a lot of challenges. You had unusual tropical diseases. You had a lot of heat-related problems. You had a lot of injuries. You know, there are a lot of big machines and motors and engines, and you had people on bases with guns, and you had alcohol, and you had drugs. So you had, in a way, sort of a mixture of a big city hospital thrown in with the normal war casualties. In my book, I talk about all that, and I also talk about some of the unique problems we had. We actually, when I was there, we began a project called Operation Golden Flow. Someone had discovered that a lot of people were becoming addicted to heroin in Vietnam, a lot of primarily Army soldiers and whatnot, but the Air Force to a certain degree. So we had ways of detecting it. We would bring them into our facility, we'd screen them, then we'd detoxify them. You had to do all of this as an inpatient. Heroin was so available in Vietnam that you couldn't have a successful outpatient treatment unit simply because the person could get heroin from any place he wanted, and he could get it fairly inexpensively too. We had our own medical society, which was good. We would get together every couple of months and hold regular medical programs, not only Air Force physicians, but Navy, Marine, Army, and we'd all get together and sort of more or less try to carry on like we did back home. You know, we would have grand rounds and we would present interesting cases and so on and so forth. One unique part of Vietnam that I talk about in some detail is we were frequently attacked at night by rockets, which were set up by the Viet Cong out in the periphery miles away, and then when you were asleep they would be launched at night. Since they set these up usually on earthen launchers and usually with a delayed fuse, they weren't real accurate, but they were very disconcerting. You'd wake up at night and the siren would be on, and the rockets would come in, and many times they would hit just empty spaces on an air base. You know, an air base has a lot of space. It has grass, runways, everything. And a lot of times it would hit there, but then sometimes it would hit a barracks or something, and with people being killed and injured in it. That was one of the more uncomfortable parts of the whole war. I guess it's analogous in some way to what the people experienced during the Britain during the bombing, you know, during the Blitz. You're just sitting there totally helpless, feeling bad, and just hoping that one of these rockets did not have your name on it. I talk about, or discuss, or write about, I should say, other people. Also, I write about the first person we got, our first aircraft we lost, and how, since I got there, and how we reacted to it, and so on and so forth, and deal with it. We had 20 F-4 Phantoms in our squadron, and the year I was there, we lost 4 in combat, and 2 of the crews were picked up, but 2 of the crews were killed. And I talk about how the squadron reacted to that, and so on and so forth. It's a difficult thing because the war goes on even when someone is killed or shot down, and sometimes they're picked up, and that's one of the great celebrations of a war. Whenever anybody was picked up, the whole base or the whole squadron who was not fine would turn out to welcome them at the flight line, and they would bring them in, the rescue, the Jolly Greens would bring them in and pull the red smoke, and champagne would come out, and it was, you know, one of the great occasions of the war. I also, in my book, write some about what it was like to live in a fighter squadron. There's certain traditions and customs. We would have a monthly party where we would celebrate the people going back home and honor the people that were lost in combat, and we had certain little customs, and I'll talk about all those. We had what was called party suits, which I don't know if any of you have ever heard of, but each squadron had a sort of like their own flight suit in a particular color that they had made by a tailor in Thailand, and these weren't used for flying, they were just used for the party, and they were known as party suits. You know, when I went back in May of 2016, I landed at Da Nang, and it was almost a surreal experience to go back to a place 45 years later. I'm sure you all have experienced it. Landed the same runway, and there's maybe a few little mementos from when I was there. When I was there, most of the fighters were stored in iron, in what we called revetments, which were half moon-shaped concrete steel shelters to prevent them from being hit by the rockets at night. And they're still there. I think they're virtually destructible. You see them all over Vietnam. But there's nothing else left. Where we had our old base operations unit is the terminal now. It's a regular commercial terminal, and the most popular restaurant at the terminal is the Burger King. So that just shows you how time changes. It really does. I went back into Laos, and it was, as I say, it was a hard place to visit. Laos is an isolated and impoverished country with no water borders. They have very few, they have no railroads. They have, the roads are very primitive. And I went back and spent a couple of days sort of wandering around on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they still have a tremendous problem from unexploded ordnance from the Vietnam War. Laos is the most bombed per capita country in the history of the world. Something like 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos in an attempt to interdict it, and they still regularly find unexploded bombs. In particular, there was a type of bomb that's used called the cluster bomb unit, which is a canister with hundreds of little bomblets, and they look like a tennis ball, and it's a real danger because children can pick them up. They're very attractive and they can look like toys. So that's a real problem today in the development of Laos. The fact that some of the unexploded ordnance has still not been cleared, you can see so many remnants of the ordnance in Laos. The people will use old bomb shells and casings for posts, fence posts or posts supporting their home or whatnot. And even today, it's a lingering problem. I spent time in Hanoi, which is probably one of the most delightful, interesting cities that I've ever visited. And Hanoi was so unlike what I thought it would be. It's a vibrant city, very worthwhile the time to visit. I also spent a couple of weeks traveling with a group of Marines who had served in Vietnam. And the Marines, we went to many of the famous Marine battle sites, the Battle of Hue, Khe Sanh, and other places, all up in the northern part of the country, what we called I Corps, the most dangerous part of the Vietnam War. And the good thing about revisiting the Vietnam War is much of it was on television. And it's so interesting. Before I would go to visit, say, a battle site, for instance, Hue, that night I could sit in my hotel, I could look up, I could see the CBS correspondent reporting on the Battle of Hue. Then I could go the next day and walk down the very street and see many of the buildings been rebuilt or exactly the same. You could go to the Khe Sanh combat base and see you can see film of where the Marines were dug in, where the runway is, and you can go back and see the very same thing. And it's fortuitous for a traveler, but I think, and I've always thought this, the fact that it was on television is one of many reasons that the war was so unpopular. And I think perhaps had they had World War II or the Korean War on television too, they would have been a little bit more unpopular, because the war is a brutal, bloody existence, and when you see it live or see films of it, it gives you a totally different perspective. People often ask me, how was I received by the Vietnamese? And before I went there, I tell people probably the last 4 years of my life, or 5 years, have been 100% Vietnam. And what I mean by that, I've read Vietnam, and I've read, I can't tell you how many times I've read, and I can't tell you how many veterans I've talked to. I'll go by, and all you have to do is ask a veteran, what did you do? And just sit there and listen, and you learn a lot, and I've learned so much from the people at my fighter wing arena. I've learned so much from everybody, and I enjoy that. So I was really immersed in Vietnam, and I'd always read that the Vietnamese liked the Americans, and I was extremely skeptical of that. I'm sort of a skeptical kind of person normally in a lot of ways, but I believe it's true, and I think it's true for several reasons. First of all, it's in our mutual interest for our two countries to have good relationships. We're the counterbalance to China. And the Vietnamese do not like the Chinese. The Chinese, even though they were their allies and supporters during the Vietnam War, historically, Vietnam was ruled by China for nearly 1,000 years. They don't, in today's Vietnamese do not like the Chinese. Every Vietnamese I talked to almost would raise that issue with me without being asked. So I think that's one reason they like Americans. Another reason, they have sort of a Buddhist Confucian tradition, and I think they're generally a forgiving people. And also they won the war, so they can be a little bit more forgiving. But more importantly, probably 25% of them, of the today's Vietnamese at most, have a living memory of the Vietnam War. Most of them, every one of them I asked, and before I went back on this, I'd signed the contract to write my book, so I really spent a lot of time asking and digging questions, and every one of them has somebody in their family who was, a grandfather, a father, or uncle, somebody who was killed. They lost somewhere, it's hard to, maybe 2 to 3 million people out of a population of, I don't know what it was then, maybe 35 million people. So you can imagine they lost as much as 10% of their population. So everyone has a family member who was lost in the Vietnamese War. Some were North Vietnamese, some were South Vietnamese, so on and so forth. I don't have any great words of wisdom to impart on it. Probably the one thing that could make a good 11th commandment, though, would be for the United States to stay out of land wars in Asia. You can't believe, and I've been to China, India, Turkey, Vietnam, you cannot believe the number of people there. It's, for instance, there are nearly 1.5 billion people in China, but until you're actually in the midst of them, you can't imagine how many people there are. And these authoritarian governments can tolerate casualties. If you have 1,200,000,000 people, you can afford to lose some of them in a land war. So that's something our country would do well to avoid. That's about it. When we get through, I do have my books for sale, and I hope you'll buy them. I have a copy of my first book, and I've got plenty. I won't run out of books. I've got some out in the car, I can tell you. And they're $20, and if you don't have cash or a check, I've got a little self-addressed envelope. You can just take a book in an envelope and mail it to me when you want to. But now I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes, sir.
I know this is probably a dumb question to everybody here today, but why were we there started?
It was one of the proxy wars of the Cold War. And I talk about that a little bit in my book. I'm a Cold War baby, and we fought the Cold War. We fought it in China, in Taiwan. We fought it in Germany, East Germany, West Germany. We fought it in Korea. This was another proxy war. Looking back, it might have been a good one to avoid, but it was all Cold War driven. But your point is very good. People ask me, another question I get commonly is that people say, well, why didn't we just go in and bomb and destroy Hanoi? Well, you can't really do that when you're fighting a war with somebody who's not, invading your country, so to speak, as Vietnam was. But the best I can answer that, it was part of a bigger picture, the Cold War, which we did prevail in eventually. Yes, sir.
I have a good friend in Aberdeen who was assigned as a colonel to the Air Met unit.
Mm-hmm.
And he would fly his helicopter up to the war zone,
Mm-hmm.
pick up the casualties, fly them to the closest MASH, and he'd turn around and he would go back.
Mm-hmm.
And so he talks very gingerly about his experiences in the Air Met unit.
Yeah. Now, what I did was different, but that's probably what you might be calling about dust-offs. Frequently Army, sometimes Marine helicopters would go, bring in supplies, take out wounded people. And those people had a phenomenal toll. And the Air Force lost something like 2,000 planes in the war. Well, the Army helicopters was something like 5,000, and they were very vital kink in getting people to the hospital. And if you got people to a hospital, they had something like almost 90 plus, if they got to the hospital, the 95% chance of living.
He was flying, he started out flying his helicopter with two cots. I guess that's what you call them on the, but he wound up having to do four because the casualties on the war zone became so immense.
And he sounds like he was there during this time we're talking about, 68, 69.
He was there during the rough time.
Yeah, and by the time I got there in 70 and 71, they'd taken a lot of American troops and withdrawn them, but they still had the air war going strong, but the ground war, that, remember President Nixon, that was his big, I'm winding down the war, Vietnamizing it, and that.
From getting his ROTC commission from Mississippi State,
Uh-huh.
he immediately went over to Vietnam. He's what, 72, 73?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the time zone that you're talking about in your book.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and he also said he flew about 60 missions, and he was one of the few that was never shot down.
Mm-hmm.
But he never got a bullet.
Mm-hmm.
Neither did his helicopter.
Mm-hmm.
What did the Vietnamese call the Vietnam War?
I believe they refer to it as the American War. And you know, they fought, you've heard, some people have called it the 10,000 Day War, the war that began after the Second World War ended when Vietnam declared independence, and they fought the French until 1954 when the French withdrew after their loss at Dien Bien Phu, and we sort of picked up the gauntlet, so to speak, and we left in 73.
Tell me a little bit about your Ironman run in Vietnam. Where was it held? How many participants?
Well, it was actually, it's not much of an Ironman story. My book has the other book, The Good Ironman Story. But it was, I did with a couple of other guys, it was, the part I did was a 56-mile bicycle ride, and it was just around the city and out in the country and so on and so forth. And then I had a buddy who did the swim, one who did the run, you know. So it was hot. I was glad. I would have probably had trouble doing the whole thing, yeah. But I did, you know, obviously when you're younger, things are a lot easier. When I turned 60, I did those, over the next 6 or 7 years, I did 6 Ironman triathlons, and I went to Brazil and Switzerland and New Zealand and South Africa and Arizona and China, you know. So, and that's a good story, you know. So if any of you have anybody who's interested in exercise, that'd be a good story.
Explain to the people exactly what an Ironman triathlon is.
Well, what they call a full Ironman triathlon is like a 2.4 mile swim, and then a 112-mile bike, and then a marathon, a 26.2 run. So that's what Ironman. And it started out in the late 70s, and it sort of the last 15, 20 years it's become more popular, and they have them in a lot of spots now. You know, you all probably have seen the one in Hawaii on television. That was the first one, yeah.
When there are interviews with Vietnam veterans, have you found any of them to be hesitant or resistant to share their experience?
Yes, you know, that was one thing that I learned. I sort of thought in the back of my mind, you know, they've done big studies of Vietnamese veterans, and generally speaking, they're very well-adjusted people who've done well, especially compared to their peers. But there are some people who I have very high respect, very successful people who still are bothered by having served in Vietnam, you know. So I did not realize that until I got it.
Health provider and with home health,
Mm-hmm.
and there were, I would say, many patients who, if they had dementia couldn't reason with them.
Mm-hmm.
And they would just scream and would take medication.
You know, the more I learn about it, the more that I realize it is a real and significant problem. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What about Operation Homecoming? Do you credit Henry Kissinger and Nixon with bringing home the POWs?
Yeah, you know, the POWs, and I would love to have the chance to talk to Mr. Harris, Colonel Harris, but they, Nixon, and I don't want to speak for him, but as compared to Johnson, I think they have a higher opinion of Nixon, and I credit him for it. Now, you can make an argument he should have done it earlier, I don't know, but President Johnson, for whatever reason, he sort of hid the prisoner of war problem. And then roughly around the time Nixon came in, the wives, complained and brought the issue to the forefront, and he adopted it, whatever his motives were, President Nixon, and promoted it, bringing it down, and became something that we all knew about and cared about. And so I guess I do credit him with him. You could make an argument that he should have done it earlier. I don't know.
Were there bases in Laos?
No, that was the so-called secret war. That was a neutral country. In 1962, they had the Geneva Accords, and it's a neutral country. And the North Vietnamese and the Americans were supposed to withdraw. Well, the North Vietnamese kept sending people in Laos down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we kept attacking them secretly, never saying we were there, and we got all the way to, I think, 1971 before we admitted that we were even flying there.
Well, my brother was in the Air Force, and he would be flying into Laos.
Yeah, that's what I
He
probably.
never went into Vietnam.
Yeah.
He was in and out of Laos.
Yeah, there were a lot of Americans stationed in Laos, flying small aircraft in support of the Hmong tribesmen.
Never asked him if he landed there.
Now,
I think they just flew from somewhere else and went into Laos.
like the missions I flew were from South Vietnam, but the targets were in Laos. So probably 80% of them were in Laos.
Probably been having a fit if I'd known he was.
Yeah. And that's one difference too. The people who were shot down in North Vietnam and captured became prisoners, and the people who were shot down in Laos were by and large executed. They didn't take many prisoners. They had something like 300-something flyers missing in action in Laos at the end of the war, and 8 of them came home as prisoners. So most of them are thought to have died in the rough terrain or had been executed.
Like a lot of people who
Doesn't talk about it.
They had a big CIA presence in Laos as well.
Yeah.
Air America.
Exactly.
Remember flew in.
The CIA directed it. It was different. The CIA were the ones, and the ambassador to Laos and the CIA were the ones that drove. And Air America was the unofficial American airline.
Air America and Continental Air Cargo were actively recruiting would-be pilots. I talked to them in '68 about going to work for flying a heliocarrier in and out of Laos and Cambodia. Yeah, big money.
I bet they were. That's what I've heard.
And
Yeah.
it was run strictly by the CIA.
Yeah.
And those guys, if they got shot down, there was an article in the Fort Worth Star Telegram when I was out there. It listed the 2 Army officers that was with the pilot, the co-pilot, and said pilot, co-pilot unknown. So if you took that job, you made good money, but when you died over there, nobody knew what happened to you.
That's true, and you generally was not acknowledged, you know, that you, and the people who did that, the Air Force people who did that, they would actually be discharged from the Air Force, become a civilian, and then work for the CIA, and then when that tour was open, they rejoined the Air Force.
The salary for a pilot was $4,600 a month tax-free.
Mm-hmm.
You would put it in a Hong Kong account.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to stay there a year to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting deal.
And you know, I think I made about $1,000, and I was really happy. I mean, that was a lot of money back then because they gave you flight pay, combat pay, medical pay, and I thought I was rich. Yeah.
It was all good.
Non-taxable.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I talk about that incident. Anybody read the book? The first chapter, I talk about how I went to Vietnam a day early. I left the Philippines. I left Jungle Survival School in order to get into Vietnam on the last day of the month, so I would be eligible for a full month's combat pay and a full month's tax deduction. And lo and behold, we got attacked the first night I was there. So that was. Anyone else? It's been a very good questions. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of the movies that we've seen over the years and documentaries present the chaos of the Vietnam War. Did you have a sense of the chaos while you were actually there serving, or was that just something later?
It was really busy and unpredictable, and different people had different experiences there. You know, you would think from the movies that everybody's out in the rice paddies and jungles fighting, when that's probably at most 1/4 of the people. Most people were supporting in various other jobs. So it was busy and it was unpredictable, that's for sure. Did anyone watch the Ken Burns series? Yeah. Any thoughts on that? I thought, I'll tell you my thought. I thought it had very inclusive. It covered everything. I thought maybe the emphasis I didn't quite agree with. You would think everybody came back from Vietnam was a crazy, disturbed person. And in reality, most people who came back from Vietnam were proud of having served there and were able to go on and be successful in their life, you know. But it's very, you know, I've watched it 2 or 3 times, and if you watch it all, one go-round's like watching 9 movies. So, anything else? Very much thank you. I'll be happy to sign these books. I thank Margaret for inviting me. I'm glad to see everybody, and I wish all of you the very best.
One person I forgot to mention, and I want to recognize her now, and that's Janie Alexander. She was the mastermind behind the Vietnam Wall in Tupelo, which is really something to see if you have not seen it. Janie, would you stand? Thank you for what you've done.
And she's going to take me there and show me.
So, and books are for sale, so anyway, thank you for coming.